At 543 hours on May 14, 1945, Corporal Vance wasn't just fighting the Japanese. He was being swallowed by Okinawa itself. He sat submerged in a foxhole that had surrendered to the monsoon, the walls dissolving into a thick, visceral soup of copper-colored clay and stagnant rainwater. For 6 hours, the Japanese artillery had maintained a rhythmic, soul-crushing cadence. It had long since ceased to be sound. It was now a concussive weight that settled in his marrow and made his molars ache. With every heavy impact, the earth beneath him shuddered like a dying beast, the trench walls constricting as if trying to bury him alive. Vance was only 22, but the islands had stolen his youth. With the grit of a dozen ridges ground into his pores and eyes hollowed out by 72 hours of forced wakefulness, he carried the shattered expression of a man in his 50s. His gaze was locked on a stand of kunai grass 30 yards out. It was deathly still, but Vance could feel the eyes watching him back. The silence in the grass was a countdown. He knew the moment the steel rain stopped falling, the screaming would begin. The artillery was a force of nature, but Vance's real nightmare was made of wood and steel. Clutched in his slick, muddy hands was the M1 Garand. In a dry briefing room in D.C., it was a triumph of American ingenuity. A semi-automatic marvel capable of punching .30 caliber holes through steel helmets from 400 yards out. To the brass at the rear, it was the great implement of liberty. But here, in a hole that felt increasingly like a pre-dug grave, the Garand was a 10-pound anchor. At nearly 4 feet long, the rifle was designed for the sweeping plains of France and the rolling hills of Germany. But Okinawa wasn't a map. It was a labyrinth of jagged trenches, subterranean tunnels, and lightless caves. The geometry of the Pacific War was measured in inches, not yards. When an Imperial soldier tumbled into your foxhole with a fixed bayonet or a serrated knife, the distance was often shorter than the rifle itself. In those frantic, narrow seconds, trying to maneuver 43 inches of walnut and iron was like trying to swing a sledgehammer inside a closet. By the time you cleared the mud-slicked walls to bring the sights to bear, the steel was already in your ribs. Vance stared down at the weapon as if it were a traitor. The walnut stock was a slick, treacherous mess of oil and monsoon rain, and the internal action ground with the sickening crunch of embedded grit. He didn't just distrust the rifle, he loathed it. For 7 days, he had been a front-row witness to a slaughter dictated by physics. He'd seen a kid from 2nd Platoon, a private who still smelled like the States, try to clear a Japanese spider hole with a light carbine. The boy had been jerked into the earth like prey by a predator, unable to swing his barrel in the cramped darkness before the dirt swallowed his screams. The nature of the war had mutated. The lethal margin had shriveled from the distance of a football field to the reach of a desperate hand. Yet, the Marine Corps remained a church of marksmanship, preaching the doctrine of aimed fire and the gentleman's tools of a long-range war. Vance's knuckles turned bone-white as he squeezed the Garand. He knew the grass was about to exhale a wave of killers, and he knew this precision instrument was a death sentence. He needed the one tool they had forbidden him to bring. The memory of the Russell Islands felt like a fever dream now. 6 months ago, the world had been saturated in technicolor, blinding sun, sapphire water, and a breeze that didn't smell like rot. It was a bustling industrial holiday. The battalion was unboxing the arsenal of democracy, tearing into crates fresh from the factory floors of Detroit and the workshops of Connecticut. While other Marines were elbow-deep in the thick cosmoline of new Browning machine guns or bartering for the terrifying weight of flamethrowers, Vance had bypassed the modern marvels. He walked past the rows of gleaming Garands and presented the supply sergeant with a specific, handwritten demand. He didn't want the rifleman's pride. He wanted a Winchester Model 12, a 12-gauge pump-action riot gun. The reaction was as sharp as a slap. The supply sergeant let out a bark of laughter so violent he fumbled his clipboard into the dirt, asking Vance if he planned on bagging some ducks between banzai charges. The noise acted like a magnet for the idle and the bored. A lieutenant from Fox Company sauntered over, his eyes landing on the Winchester with visible disdain. He hoisted the weapon by its barrel, dangling it like a stinking, 3-day-old fish. He made a theatrical performance of squinting down the wide, yawning bore before fixing Vance with a condescending smirk. He wondered aloud if Vance expected the Imperial Army to fly over in a V formation, or if he'd simply mistaken the bloody invasion of the Ryukyu Islands for a pheasant hunt in the Nebraska brush. The surrounding Marines erupted, a harsh, mocking chorus that drew a line in the sand between the real soldiers and the eccentric. To them, the Winchester, with its smooth walnut pump and sleek, hammerless frame, was a quaint relic. It looked like a family heirloom meant for a mantelpiece in a quiet cabin, not a tool for the mechanized slaughter of the 20th century. Vance remained a statue in the center of the derision. He offered no defensive quips, no humble smiles. He simply reclaimed the weapon from the lieutenant's grasp and began to work. There was a sudden, jarring silence as the men watched his hands. His efficiency was surgical, a rhythmic dance of steel and oil that briefly choked the laughter out of the air. He stripped the action, slicked the bolt, and tested the slide with a sound like a deadbolt slamming home. He didn't need to argue because he understood the grim arithmetic of the perfect repeater. This wasn't a bird gun. It was a delivery system for a specific, intimate kind of carnage. With 6 shells in the magazine and a 7th in the chamber, the Winchester was a storm in waiting. Each shell was a hive of 9 pellets of 0 buckshot, each lead ball the size of a .32 caliber slug. Vance knew that every pull of the trigger didn't send a single, hopeful bullet toward a target. It unleashed a wall of lead. And in the dark, he could unleash that wall as fast as his heart could beat and his arm could pump. The ridicule didn't stay on the islands. It boarded the transport ships like a contagion. During the agonizing, salt-sprayed weeks at sea, a clear divide formed in the flickering shadows of the troop berthing. While the rest of the platoon performed the sacred rituals of the infantry, honing bayonets to a razor's edge or obsessing over the windage on their sights, Vance sat cross-legged on his rack, endlessly drilling the load and sweep. He became the farmer, a walking punchline. Marines would flick empty sea-ration tins across the compartment, shouting "pull," followed by a chorus of cruel whistles. Bets were placed in the mess hall on how many minutes of combat it would take for Vance to ditch the scattergun for a man's rifle, scavenged from a fresh corpse. Even his squad leader, a man whose soul seemed to have been replaced by the jagged volcanic rock of Guadalcanal, tried to talk sense into him. The sergeant didn't mock. He lectured with the weary patience of a man talking to a suicide victim. He laid out the cold logistics of the coming slaughter. Shotgun shells were fat, heavy, and a nightmare to carry in bulk. He hammered home the math of the 40-yard lethality, explaining that in a war of ridges and valleys, Vance was choosing to be a bystander. He warned him that when the Japanese opened up from a distant tree line 200 yards out, Vance wouldn't be a combatant. He'd be a liability, a spectator in a shooting gallery, clutching a toy while his brothers-in-arms did the heavy lifting. Vance absorbed the criticism without a word. On paper, the brass was right. In a textbook war of maps and respectful distances, the shotgun was a punchline. It couldn't punch through steel or reach across a valley. But Vance wasn't preparing for a textbook war. He was preparing for a haunting. He had listened to the survivors of Peleliu and Tarawa, men who spoke of enemies that lived like spiders in the earth, waiting for you to step over them before rising to claim your back. He heard about the midnight bands, charges, where the world became a blur of screaming voices and silver blades, leaving no time for the gentlemanly ritual of aiming. In that kind of chaos, surgical precision was a luxury the dead couldn't afford. You didn't need a scalpel, you needed a sledgehammer. At 5 feet, you didn't need to hit a man's heart. You needed to hit him with enough kinetic energy to physically stop his momentum and hurl him backward. The Garand was an instrument of marksmanship, but the Winchester was an instrument of physics. Vance wanted to turn the air into a meat grinder, a solid wall of lead that would shred anything it touched. So he bore the weight of the jokes and the sting of the insults. He slept with the weapon cradled in oilcloth like a child, shielding it from the corrosive salt of the Pacific. Even as they descended the cargo nets into the landing craft, the lieutenant's final jeer followed him down, a warning that when the lead started flying, no one would waste their breath covering a man playing with a bird gun. In the mud of the foxhole, the debate ended. The artillery barrage lifted with an abruptness that made the silence feel like a physical weight. Then, a Japanese signal whistle pierced the air, high, shrill, and alien. Suddenly, the kunai grass ceased to be vegetation. It transformed into a surging wall of humanity. Hundreds of soldiers rose from the earth like vengeful spirits, mud sloughing off their uniforms as they leveled their bayonets. They moved in an eerie, disciplined silence, a gray tide of steel rushing toward the American line. Vance discarded the M1 Garand without a second thought, letting the masterpiece splash into the filth at his feet. He reached into the dry, hollowed-out niche in the trench wall and retrieved the Winchester. As the oilcloth fell away, the parkerized steel caught the gray dawn. He racked the slide, clack, clack. It was a heavy, industrial sound that promised a different kind of conversation. To his left, Miller, the kid who had spent the voyage mocking Vance with duck calls, was falling apart. His hands, slick with cold sweat and clay, fumbled a clip. The brass pinged uselessly against the rifle's receiver before vanishing into the muck. Miller looked at his jammed weapon, then at the screaming wave of bayonets now mere yards away, and finally at Vance. His eyes were wide with the realization that his real rifle had just become a club. Vance didn't offer a glance of "I told you so." He stepped into the lip of the trench, bracing his boots in the shifting clay. He didn't bother with a traditional rifleman's stance. He tucked the walnut stock firmly under his armpit, locking it against his ribs for the coming recoil. He leveled the wide mouth of the barrel at the center of the charging mass. The Japanese were screaming now, a primal, guttural banzai that tore through the rhythm of the rain. The lead runner was 15 yards out, close enough for Vance to see the sweat on the man's lip and the frantic, lethal intent in his eyes. The experts had their theories, the lieutenant had his jokes, and the sergeant had his maps. But as Vance's finger took up the slack on the trigger, the era of theory was over. He was about to introduce the Imperial infantry to the bird gun. The first discharge didn't mimic the sharp crack of a rifle. It was a thunderous boom that felt like a cannon firing in a confined hallway. The Winchester bucked against Vance's ribs with the mean, rhythmic kick of a mule. A 3-foot tongue of orange flame lanced through the gray monsoon, illuminating the carnage. Inside that flash, 9 lead spheres traveling at 1,200 feet per second found their mark. The lead soldier, the man with the gold teeth, didn't just fall, he ceased to be a threat. The buckshot hammered into his chest with such kinetic force that it defied his forward momentum, launching him backward as if he'd been struck by a high-speed locomotive. He vanished into a violent mist of crimson and shredded khaki, but Vance was already moving. He didn't have the luxury of watching the man fall, because the gray wave was still cresting, 20 more men screaming toward his hole. This was the moment the bird gun mutated into a monster. Vance exploited the Winchester's most lethal secret, the lack of a trigger disconnector. In a modern weapon, safety requires a deliberate release of the trigger for every shot. But the Model 12 was a relic of a more brutal era of engineering. Vance buried his finger against the trigger and held it there, turning his right arm into a piston. As long as he pumped the slide, the weapon would fire the millisecond the bolt slammed home. It was no longer a shotgun. It was a hand-cranked engine of slaughter, a manual machine gun that turned the air in front of the trench into a localized hurricane of lead. Vance's finger remained a frozen hook against the trigger. He slammed the fore-end back, a smoking brass hull spinning into the mud, and drove it forward. Boom! A Japanese sergeant, sword raised for a killing blow, was folded nearly in half by the impact. Vance's arm became a rhythmic blur. Clack, clack, boom. The third man didn't just fall, he spun like a top, his legs swept out from under him by the spreading pattern of lead. The individual shots began to bleed into one another, a continuous mechanical pounding that shook the very walls of the foxhole. Clack, clack, boom. Clack, clack, boom. In under 4 seconds, the Winchester had exhaled its entire magazine. 6 shells, 54 individual slugs. Vance had projected a lethal curtain 12 feet wide and 4 feet high into the rainy dawn. The front rank of the charge didn't simply die, it evaporated into the mud. The soldiers in the second wave stumbled over the remains of the first, their momentum dying in the face of the impossible. They had been trained to listen for the rhythmic ping of a Garand, the brief window of a reload. They weren't prepared for a human buzzsaw. The gun clicked empty, but Vance's hands didn't skip a beat. He dropped back into the slurry of the trench, his movements fueled by the thousands of repetitions he'd performed in the dark of the transport ship. There was no time to feed the tube. He snatched a single shell from his pouch and combat loaded it directly into the open throat of the receiver. He racked it home and surged upward. A Japanese infantryman was already perched on the lip of the trench, his bayonet poised over the trembling Miller. Vance fired from the hip, and the attacker was erased from the skyline. Vance ducked, fed another, racked, and rose again. He had become a piston engine of singular purpose. Load one, shoot one. Load one, shoot one. To his side, Miller, the boy who had led the mockery, could only watch with a ghostly, hollow expression. He wasn't looking at a farmer anymore. He was looking at a demon of the mud. The Imperial charge didn't just break, it shattered against the trench line. The survivors, witness to the instantaneous carnage at the front, scrambled for the safety of the kunai grass or dove into the mud. A new silence settled over the ridge, thick with the acrid bite of cordite and the scent of scorched walnut. Vance stood anchored in the mire, his chest heaving in ragged bursts. The Winchester's barrel was a rod of smoking iron, the rain hissing as it struck the hot metal and sent tiny plumes of steam into the gray light. His shoulder was a map of blossoming bruises, thrumming with the dull ache of a dozen sledgehammer blows, but he was standing. Miller was breathing. The line had held. The lieutenant came stumbling down the trench, his service pistol drawn and his voice raw as he shrieked for the men to hold their fire. He skidded to a halt at the edge of Vance's position, his boots churning the clay. He stared at the field, at the heap of shredded khaki and the absolute, geometric ruin of the vegetation 10 yards out. Finally, his gaze drifted to the bird gun clutched in Vance's muddy hands. The lieutenant opened his mouth, his throat working to find a command or a lingering sarcasm, but the words died in his throat. The smirk was buried under the weight of the evidence. He realized in that hollow, terrifying moment that the farmer's toy hadn't just saved the squad, it had functioned as a one-man meat grinder. Without a word, he swallowed his pride, gave Vance a short, grim nod and moved on. He didn't mention pheasants. He didn't suggest picking up a real rifle. He simply walked away, leaving the farmer to his harvest. But the dawn slaughter was merely a bloody introduction. As the sun began to dip, staining the sky the color of a fresh bruise, the nature of the war shifted from mechanized violence to psychological terror. The Japanese commander on Okinawa wasn't interested in the broad, sweeping maneuvers of the European theater. He was a master of the infiltrator's war. Under the cover of the gathering gloom, the enemy became shadows. They were experts at the belly crawl, moving through the sucking mud with the agonizing patience of predators, inching closer until they were breathing the same air as the men in the trenches. Their goal was to turn the American firepower into a liability, to get so close that a rifle shot was as likely to kill a brother as an enemy. When the darkness finally fell, it was absolute, dropping over the ridge like a heavy, suffocating shroud. The rain returned in a violent torrent, erasing whatever was left of the horizon. Visibility vanished. A man couldn't see his own white knuckles gripped around his weapon. This was the dead time, where every rustle of the kunai grass sounded like a whetted blade and every shifting stone was a death sentence. For the men clutching their Garands, the night was a trap. The long, elegant rifles were clumsy intruders in the dark. If you managed to squeeze off a shot at a ghost in the shadows, the blinding muzzle flash would sear your retinas, leaving you helpless and blind for the seconds it took for the enemy to close the final 3 feet. The Garand was a tool for the horizon, but in the pitch black of Okinawa, the horizon had ceased to exist. Vance retreated into the silence of his own mind, his ears straining against the rhythmic hiss of the rain on his steel pot. The Winchester was back in his lap, its magazine topped off with 6 fresh shells, crimson paper hulls capped with dull brass. He felt a heavy hand on his shoulder. It was the sergeant, the veteran of Guadalcanal. The man's voice was a ragged whisper, stripped of its earlier arrogance. He reported movement near the wire, ghosts in the mud, 20 yards out. He didn't order Vance to the front, he asked. It was a quiet surrender to the reality of the night. The sergeant understood that in this lightless void, the aimed fire of a rifle was a fantasy. He didn't need a marksman. He needed a trench broom to sweep the darkness clean. Vance eased himself toward the lip of the sandbags. He closed his eyes, letting his hearing take over where his vision failed. There it was, the wet, rhythmic thwip of limbs dragging through saturated clay. Then, the metallic snip-snip of wire cutters. The sound was surgical, nearly lost in the downpour. But Vance didn't need to see his targets to kill them. This was the dark poetry of the 12-gauge. At 20 yards, the buckshot wouldn't be a single point of failure. It would be a widening cone of lead the size of a man's torso. He didn't need to find a heart in the dark. He just needed to find the air they were breathing. He let them crawl. He waited until the sounds of their exertion, the heavy, ragged breathing and the faint, briny scent of their rice rations, filled the air just beyond the trench. They were 10 yards out, coiled like springs for the final, screaming leap. Vance stood up slowly, a shadow within shadows. He didn't waste a second on a battle cry or a flare. He simply reached for the fore-end and worked the action. Clack, clack. The sound was a mechanical death sentence, echoing in the small space between the 2 armies. For the infiltrators, it was the last thing they would ever hear. The sound was an industrial death knell. In the suffocating tension of the night, the racking of a pump-action shotgun is a universal language. It is a mechanical, violent promise that the time for stealth has expired. The crawling stopped instantly. The silence that followed was heavy with the sudden, cold terror of men who knew what was coming. Every soldier in the Pacific understood that sound. It meant that the darkness wasn't hiding a rifleman who might miss, but a storm that couldn't. Vance leveled the barrel toward the last sound of shifting mud and squeezed. Boom! The muzzle flash tore through the night like a localized lightning strike. For a fraction of a second, the world was frozen in a strobe-light nightmare. 3 Japanese infiltrators, caught like insects in the barbed wire, their faces masked in clay and their hands clutching grenades. The lead man caught the center of the pattern and was erased. The darkness slammed back down, searing Vance's retinas, but he didn't need his eyes, he had his rhythm. He pinned the trigger, pump boom. He pivoted the barrel 2 feet to the right, pump boom. He swept left, pump boom. He delivered 4 rounds in under 2 seconds, watering the perimeter with a horizontal spray of lead like a man using a fire hose on a burning lawn. The screams were brief, jagged, and quickly silenced by the rain. As a Japanese Nambu machine gun began to stitch red tracers across the lip of the trench in a blind rage, Vance ducked back into the safety of the mud. The immediate threat hadn't just been neutralized, it had been deleted. Miller, huddled in a trembling ball at the bottom of the foxhole, looked up with hollow eyes and whispered a single question. "Did you get him?" Vance didn't offer the comfort of an answer. He simply began the steady, mechanical ritual of thumbing fresh shells into the magazine. Click, click, click. His hands were as steady as a watchmaker's. He had finally found his role in the madness of Okinawa. He wasn't a marksman or a hero. He was a janitor. His job was to sweep away the nightmares when they got too close for comfort, and business was booming. By dawn, the order to hold had expired. The battalion was moving up. Headquarters had their eyes on the Sugar Loaf, a squat, unassuming mound of earth that served as the keystone for the entire Japanese defensive architecture. From a distance, it looked like a harmless pile of dirt, innocent and abandoned. But the maps lied. The hill was a hollowed-out fortress, a limestone labyrinth of 4 concentric trench rings connected by a subterranean web of tunnels and reinforced concrete bunkers. It wasn't a tactical objective. It was a meat grinder designed to turn infantry battalions into statistics. The captain gathered the platoon leaders in the pale gray light. The plan was a grim, blunt instrument, a frontal assault on the first line of trenches at 800 hours, fixed bayonets, bone-to-bone combat. The captain's gaze swept over the circle of hollow-eyed, mud-caked faces before settling on Vance. His eyes didn't linger on the man but on the weapon. This time, there was no mockery, no dismissive smirk. He pointed a gloved finger at the Winchester and issued a new standing order. When the platoon hit the lip of that first trench, no one was to set foot inside until the shotgun had cleared the way. Vance gave a sharp, silent nod and performed a final inventory. He had 40 rounds of double-aught buckshot left in his pouches. In a civilian world, 40 rounds felt like an eternity. Here, facing a mountain of hidden tunnels, it felt like a handful of sand against a tide. He topped off the magazine, the metallic click-click-click sounding like a clock ticking down to 0. He racked the slide, a final, heavy mechanical heartbeat, and took his place at the head of the column. The toy was no longer a joke. It was the tip of the spear. At 800, a single whistle blast signaled the end of life as they knew it. The 70 yards separating the Americans from the first Japanese line was a nightmare of churned, blood-slicked clay, a kill zone in its purest form. Japanese machine gun nests anchored the flanks of the hill, weaving a typhoon of steel into a lethal, interlocking crossfire. It was an invisible X drawn across the landscape. Anything that entered its center was simply torn apart. The first wave surged forward and was immediately decimated. Within 10 seconds, the charge had been reduced to a collection of corpses and screaming men. The air was thick with the rhythmic, tearing roar of Nambu heavy machine guns, a sound like canvas ripping on a cosmic scale. The attack didn't just slow, it froze. Marines dove into shallow craters and pressed their faces into the mire, paralyzed by the supersonic snap of lead passing inches above their spines. Vance found himself huddled in a jagged shell hole 30 yards from the objective, the air above him sizzling with the heat of the barrage. To his left, a radio operator attempted a desperate crawl forward. A single round found the boy's helmet, and he went limp in the mud. The assault was dead. Officers screamed themselves hoarse, trying to rally the pinned-down men, but their orders were drowned out by the geometry of the slaughter. Sensing the paralysis, the Japanese defenders in the first trench grew emboldened. They rose above the parapet, shouting and hurling grenades into the craters like they were tossing scraps to dogs. They were laughing. From their vantage point, the Americans weren't soldiers anymore. They were targets trapped in a bowl of mud, waiting for the final blow. Vance didn't analyze the odds. He analyzed the geometry of survival. The crater was a waiting room for the morgue, and the only way out was through the teeth of the defense. He checked the perforated steel heat shield on the Winchester, the metal still radiating a faint, ghostly warmth. While Miller was lost in a desperate, whispered prayer, Vance transitioned into a different state of being, a singular kinetic force. He surged out of the hole, not with the graceful sprint of an athlete, but with the heavy, unstoppable momentum of a freight train. Lead stitched a jagged line in the mud inches from his boots, but the Nambu gunners were preoccupied with the mass of pinned-down Marines. They dismissed the lone, mud-caked figure charging their position as a desperate suicide. They were wrong. Vance cleared the parapet and plummeted into the trench like a falling anvil. He landed in a splash of stagnant water and mud, right in the center of a five-man fire team. For one heartbeat, the world hung in a balance of pure shock, the Japanese soldiers staring at the American who had seemingly fallen from the heavens. Vance didn't give them a second to recover. He didn't even bring the stock to his cheek. He leveled the barrel from the hip and unleashed the storm. Boom! The point-blank concussion was more than just sound. It was a physical blow that rattled the wooden shoring of the trench. The first soldier was launched backward as if hit by a sledgehammer. Pump boom. The second man, his fingers still fumbling with his bolt, was folded over by a wall of lead. Vance spun like a dervish in the cramped space. Boom, boom. The air in the trench became a thick, choking fog of cordite and pulverized dirt. In under 5 seconds, the immediate sector was a tomb. He didn't pause to breathe. The sugar loaf wasn't just a trench. It was a living organism of earth and steel. He could hear the frantic, rhythmic slapping of boots against packed dirt coming from the communication tunnel, a narrow, lightless vein leading to the heart of the hill. Reinforcements were flooding in to seal the breach, a mass of men shoulder to shoulder, their bayonets gleaming in the dim subterranean light. In the open, they were a squad. In this tunnel, they were a single, long target. Vance shoved fresh shells into the Winchester, his thumbs raw and slick, with a mixture of rain and blood. He stepped into the mouth of the tunnel and waited for the clack of their equipment to get louder. They were bunching up, thinking there was safety in numbers. They were about to learn the final, brutal lesson of the Winchester. Vance stepped into the mouth of the tunnel and unleashed a mechanical hurricane. With the trigger pinned, the slam-fire mechanism transformed the Winchester into a rhythmic engine of destruction. The confined earthen walls acted like a megaphone, magnifying each blast into a concussive shockwave that rattled the very foundations of the hill. The buckshot didn't just find its mark. It ricocheted off the hard-packed clay, creating a shredding effect that turned the narrow corridor into a localized meat grinder. The front rank of the Japanese reinforcements was physically shoved backward by the kinetic impact, their bodies colliding with the men behind them in a grotesque, tangled logjam. Vance emptied the weapon until the slide clicked on an empty chamber, his hands vibrating with a violent adrenaline tremor. He had just erased an entire squad in the time it took to draw a single breath. He surged forward into the second trench line, a deeper and more sinister fortification. To his front sat a heavy machine gun nest, a bunker of coconut logs and reinforced earth that was currently spitting a stream of lead into the valley below. The gun crew was deaf to his approach, drowned out by the rhythmic, hammering roar of their own weapon. Vance didn't reach for a grenade. He didn't want to risk a bounce back. Instead, he thrust the blackened muzzle of the Model 12 directly through the rear firing aperture. He pumped 3 rounds into the cramped, dark space. The machine gun fell silent with a jarring abruptness. When Vance kicked in the rear door, he found a scene of total mechanical and human ruin. The buckshot had behaved like a swarm of angry lead hornets in the small room, ricocheting off the equipment and the walls until nothing was left moving. But the hill was now awake, and it was screaming for his blood. As Vance stepped back into the trench, the element of surprise evaporated. The Japanese were pouring out of the labyrinth on both sides. A Japanese officer, katana unsheathed and glinting in the rain, led a desperate charge from the left, while defenders began popping out of camouflaged spider holes on his right. This was the exact moment the logic of the Garand would have collapsed. A rifleman trapped in a pincer is a dead man. But Vance didn't aim, he swept. He pivoted left, the short barrel tracking faster than any eye could follow, and dropped the officer in 2 thunderous bursts. Without stopping his momentum, he spun 180 degrees, a violent, athletic twist that would have been impossible with a long rifle, and hammered the spider holes to his right. The buckshot shredded the dirt around the openings, forcing the enemy back into the earth and buying him the most precious commodity on Okinawa, 5 more seconds. The Winchester had finally gone silent. The magazine was an empty void. This was the moment of peak vulnerability the veterans had warned him about. A Japanese officer, his katana raised in a gleaming arc, recognized the dry click and surged forward from 10 feet away. Vance had no time for the surgical reload or the reach for a sidearm. He reverted to the primal. He stepped into the officer's momentum, swinging the heavy walnut stock with every ounce of his adrenaline-fueled strength. The wood met bone with a sickening crack, shattering the man's jaw and sending him spiraling into the muck. Vance pinned him down with a mud-caked boot, his hands a blur of motion as he, emergency loaded, a single shell directly into the ejection port. Clack, a muffled roar, and the threat was gone. He spent the next few minutes clearing the remainder of the second line through sheer, unadulterated aggression. He moved with a speed that defied the sucking clay, never giving the defenders a chance to stabilize. He fired at shadows. He fired at movement. He fired at the very air until the barrel of the Model 12 began to hiss, and the scent of scorching wood filled his nostrils. The perforated steel heat shield was glowing with a dull, invisible heat, searing the palm of his left hand, but the pain was a distant signal he chose to ignore. He had transcended the role of a soldier. He had become the trench broom in human form, a mechanical, rhythmic instrument of clearance. Vance crested the lip of the third trench, the support artery of the hill. Below him, at least 20 reserve troops were huddled in the process of prepping a counterassault, their hands full of grenades and Nambu pistols. They looked up to see a solitary Marine, a ghost of crimson and gray mud, standing above them with a smoking weapon. The hesitation that followed was their final act. The psychological terror of the Winchester had reached them long before Vance had. They had heard that rhythmic boom-clack-boom echoing through the tunnels like the heartbeat of a monster. They didn't see a man with a bird gun. They saw the Reaper, and in the claustrophobic confines of the ditch, they knew there was nowhere left to hide. Panic didn't just ripple through the third trench, it detonated. The disciplined Imperial line disintegrated into a frantic, scrambling mass of men. Some attempted to claw their way out of the rear of the ditch to escape the thunderous muzzle blasts, but Vance met them with the grim reality of the 12-gauge. He cut down those who fled and erased those who chose to stand. He moved through the gore like a force of nature, his boots finding purchase on the fallen as he maintained his relentless rhythm of pump-fire load. The boundary between the man and the Winchester, the assembly of steel, spring, and walnut, had dissolved. He was no longer aiming. He was simply saturating the air with enough lead to make life impossible. He was firing with a speed and area denial that no rifleman, no matter how skilled, could ever hope to replicate. By the time he crested the hill and reached the fourth line, the nerve center of the defense, Vance was a ghost. He was down to his final 5 shells. His lungs felt like they were filled with hot ash, and the skin of his left palm was a map of raw, weeping blisters from the white-hot barrel. He kicked the timber door of the command dugout off its hinges. Inside, 3 officers were frantically burning maps and shredding documents, their pistols half-drawn in a final, desperate gesture of defiance. Vance didn't hesitate. Boom, boom, boom. The deafening roar of the shotgun filled the small room, followed by a sudden, absolute silence. Vance stood in the threshold of the command post, his silhouette framed by the gray, weeping sky. Wisps of acrid smoke curled from the muzzle of the Winchester, vanishing into the rain. He pulled the trigger. Click. He racked the slide. Empty. He fumbled at his belt pouches, his fingers numb and trembling, but they found only empty canvas. He was dry. The janitor had finished his work. He slumped against the trench wall, his body finally surrendering to the weight of exhaustion as he slid down into the blood-stained mud. From his vantage point at the summit, he looked back down the slope. Below him, the American line was finally rising. The Marines stood up from their craters, blinking in the sudden absence of the X. The machine guns were silent. The grenades had stopped falling. They looked toward the crest and saw the lone, mud-caked figure who had broken the back of the fortress. A roar of cheering broke out, louder than the rain, as the battalion began to surge up the hill, not as victims but as victors. Vance watched them come, his gaze eventually falling to the weapon in his lap. The walnut stock was splintered. The finish was gouged and scarred. The parkerized steel was blackened with soot and grime. It was the most battered, ugly piece of equipment in the Pacific, and to Vance, it was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. The experts had laughed. The lieutenant had called it a toy. Vance closed his eyes, let his head fall back against the cold clay, and listened to the rain hiss against the smoking barrel. He wondered if any of them were still laughing now. The rain finally surrendered at noon. The sun cut through the leaden overcast of Okinawa like a spotlight, casting a harsh, unforgiving light on the ruin atop Sugar Loaf. The silence that followed was visceral, a heavy, vibrating stillness that occurs only when the world has run out of noise. As the Marines of the follow-up wave crested the summit with their rifles leveled, they were braced for a desperate last stand. Instead, they stepped into a catacomb. They moved through the first ring, then the second, then the third, and the bravado died in their throats. It didn't look like a battlefield. It looked like the aftermath of a localized hurricane. A rifle fight is a clinical affair of small, precise holes. A machine gun leaves predictable, stitched lines of impact. This was different. This was a natural disaster of lead and kinetic energy. Sandbags had been shredded into confetti, heavy support logs were splintered into toothpicks, and the trenches themselves had been scoured clean. The Marines lowered their weapons, their eyes widening as they navigated the debris. They weren't looking at the fallen with the usual heat of combat. They were looking with a stunned, silent reverence for the sheer magnitude of the violence that had ended the struggle. Vance was perched on a discarded crate of mortar rounds near the ruins of the command dugout. He had managed to clear the mud from his face, but his hands remained stained a deep, industrial black with soot and cordite. The Winchester Model 12 lay across his lap. In the bright midday sun, it looked like a piece of salvaged scrap. The walnut forend was spiderwebbed with cracks from the violent vibration of the slam firing. The parkerized finish was gouged, and the steel heat shield was warped from the cooling of the metal. Yet to the men gathering in a silent circle around him, the weapon didn't look like junk. It looked like Excalibur pulled from the stone of the hill. The mockery had been buried in the mud below. The jokes about Nebraska pheasant hunts had evaporated into the humid air. The soldiers looked at the battered, smoking shotgun with a kind of grim, religious awe. They finally understood the brutal math Vance had known all along. In the lightless, suffocating world of the tunnels, the toy hadn't just been a weapon, it had been the king. The lieutenant, the man who had mocked Vance about V formations and Nebraska pheasant hunts, crept into the command trench. He looked like a man who had seen the end of the world. A third of his platoon was gone, left in the X of the valley below. He walked toward Vance with a heavy, rhythmic gait, his eyes scanning the carnage of the cleared bunkers and the tangled heap of the Japanese squad in the tunnel. He didn't speak. He simply removed his helmet, ran a mud-stained hand through his matted hair, and reached for a crumpled pack of Lucky Strikes. He offered one to Vance, a silent, smoking olive branch. In the hierarchy of the Corps, it was more than a gesture. It was a formal apology. It was a recognition that when the manuals failed and the brass's theories collapsed, only one thing remained: results. The lieutenant struck a match, shielded the flame from the wind for Vance, and then looked at the battered Winchester. He asked, in a voice barely above a whisper, if Vance could scavenge another one for the point man of 2nd Squad. This stand on Sugar Loaf wasn't just Vance's personal triumph. It was a brutal vindication for a weapon that the military establishment had long treated as a crude, unwanted stepchild. The shotgun had always been the pariah of the American arsenal, dismissed as ungentlemanly, unrefined, and savage. During the First World War, the German High Command had been so unnerved by the weapon's lethality that they issued a formal diplomatic protest. They decried it as a war crime and threatened to execute any American prisoner found carrying a 12-gauge shell. There is a dark irony in that history. The Germans, the architects of mustard gas and the pioneers of the flamethrower, viewed the shotgun as a bridge too far. They claimed it caused unnecessary suffering. But in reality, they weren't offended, they were terrified. They had learned the hard way that once the Winchester entered a trench, the battle was no longer a contest of marksmanship. It was a cleaning. They were the ones who christened it the trench broom, a name that was less a description and more a warning. On Sugar Loaf, Vance had shown a new generation of soldiers why that name was earned in blood. The terror that gripped the defenders on Okinawa was a visceral, primal reaction to a weapon that defied their code. They were a warrior culture that glorified the intimacy of the blade and the spiritual victory of close-quarters combat. They wanted to see the light fade from an enemy's eyes. But the Winchester denied them that honor. It was a cold, industrial refutation of their martial spirit. It didn't matter how much courage a man possessed or how sharp his katana was. The shotgun converted that bravery into raw meat. It was an engine of erasure. A rifle bullet offered a soldier's death. A shotgun blast offered a disassembly. On the slopes of Sugar Loaf, Vance had resurrected the nightmare that had haunted the Germans 3 decades prior. Vance sat amidst the ruins, indifferent to the historical weight of his actions. He simply drew on his cigarette, his eyes fixed on the tiny, ant-like movement of medical jeeps in the valley below. At 22, the adrenaline that had fueled his ascent was draining away, leaving behind a hollow, leaden exhaustion. The coffee cup rattle of post-combat shock began to vibrate in his fingers. He looked down at the Winchester. He had fought for this gun, defended it against every sneer and polished it like a holy relic, but the pride was gone. In its place was a chilling, detached clarity. The weapon had fulfilled its grim promise. It had saved him and the men now huddled around him, but it had done so by demanding he become a butcher. As he ran a thumb over the grit-scarred receiver, he realized a quiet, heartbreaking truth. He would never hunt birds with this weapon again. You cannot return to the innocent pursuit of pheasants in a Nebraska field after you have used a bird gun to sweep the humanity out of a trench. For Vance, the war reached its conclusion on that summit. Though the meat grinder of Okinawa ground on for weeks, his unit was rotated off the line to a quiet rear area. Then came the world-shaking news of the atomic bombs, followed by the sudden, staggering reality of the surrender. The invasion of the Japanese mainland, the Operation Downfall that everyone predicted would be a literal sea of blood, was erased from the calendar. Vance went home. He sat on a train bound for Nebraska, his life packed into a single duffel bag containing his dress greens, a few scraps of ribbon, and his discharge papers. He remained silent for most of the journey, his gaze fixed on the endless, rolling cornfields. He watched the peaceful, emerald-green rows of the heartland, trying to reconcile the order of the rows with the chaotic, blood-soaked labyrinth of Sugar Loaf. When he returned to the farm, Vance didn't seek an audience. He climbed the narrow stairs to the attic and set down his duffel bag, but the Winchester stayed with him. He didn't mount it over the fireplace as a trophy of conquest, nor did he lean it against a barroom table to trade stories for drinks. Instead, he performed a final, somber ritual. He disassembled the weapon, cleaning every coil of every spring and every thread of every screw until the steel was immaculate. He applied a thick, protective shroud of heavy grease, wrapped the components in oilcloth, and sealed them in a wooden crate at the back of his closet. He never pulled the trigger again. When the autumn air turned crisp and his neighbors called him to the fields for the pheasant hunt, he offered quiet deflections. His back was stiff, or the harvest was too demanding. The truth was far more intimate. He couldn't endure the music of the weapon. The clack-clack of the slide didn't suggest the flight of birds. It echoed with the scent of cordite and the subterranean screams of the tunnels. It was a sound that vibrated not just in the air, but in his marrow. Vance's life became a study in quiet resilience. He married a girl from the neighboring county, raised 3 children, and watched the seasons shift over his corn and soybeans. To the people of his town, he was a fixture of the community, a school board member, a hardworking neighbor, a man who had done his bit. They remained blissfully unaware of the 4 rings of trenches on a hill called Sugar Loaf. They never knew that for one blood-soaked morning in 1945, this soft-spoken man had been the most lethal force on the island of Okinawa. They never suspected that the bird gun in his dark closet was a relic of industrial slaughter. Vance passed away in 2004 at the age of 81. In the quiet days following the funeral, his grandson began the task of sorting through a lifetime of history. In the shadows of the closet, he discovered the wooden crate. As the oilcloth fell away, the scent of vintage grease and cold steel filled the room, the smell of 1945. The grandson hoisted the Winchester, noting its surprising, solid weight. He traced his fingers over the spider-webbed cracks in the walnut and the deep gouges in the receiver. He gripped the fore-end and racked the slide. Clack, clack. The mechanical sound was sharp, rhythmic, and hauntingly perfect. The boy didn't know the history. To him, it was merely a cool old gun. He had no way of knowing he was holding the trench broom that had shattered a fortress. That is why we preserve these fragments. That is why we sift through the dry ink of after-action reports and the dust of archives. Men like Vance don't seek the spotlight. They don't write memoirs or demand the world's attention. They simply do the impossible, endure the unimaginable, and then return home to walk the rows of a quiet farm. They let the shadows of the past fade into the soil. But those stories must not be allowed to vanish. The legend of the farmer's toy that broke an army demands to be heard. The man who ignored the experts to trust his own gut deserves to be remembered. The Winchester Model 12 was more than a configuration of wood and steel. It was a testament. It stood as brutal proof that when the world descends into chaos, the old ways often remain the only ways. It proved that in the heart of the storm, you don't always need a satellite link, a precision optic, or a complex computer. Sometimes, the only things that stand between a young man and a shallow grave are mechanical reliability and the unyielding courage to hold the line. Vance possessed both in abundance. And because he chose to carry a bird gun, countless Marines returned to their own homes who otherwise would have been swallowed by the mud of Okinawa. If you believe that voices like Vance's deserve to be rescued from the dustbin of history, take a moment to hit that like button. It's a small gesture that tells the algorithm that real heroism still carries weight today. It helps us uncover more stories hidden in the shadows and bring them into the light. And if you haven't yet, join us. Subscribe to help us build this library of the forgotten, a living monument to the men who did the heavy lifting while the world was on fire. We want to hear from you. Did you have a grandfather or a great-uncle who served in the Pacific? What did they carry? What was the weight of the stories they brought home? Leave a comment below. We are committed to ensuring these memories don't fade into the soil. Vance has taken his place in the long gray line of history, but the echo of that pump action remains. Clack, clack. Thank you for watching. We'll see you in the next trench.